if anybody had reason to curse and be a bit pissy about what happened, it's probably Max Verstappen, and Mad Max is back. So, Laz, just take us through. He experienced an onslaught of penalties in Mexico, I think is fair. What happened, and do you think that the penalties in question were justified?
Yeah, so he racked up 20 seconds of penalties for incidents on a single lap, lap 10, I think it was, of the Grand Prix, while fighting with, guess who, his title rival, Lando Norris. And of course, it was only a week earlier that Lando Norris was the one penalised for their exchange on track and going off the track and overtaking and all the rest of it. And so when it came about in Mexico that they were sharing a piece of tarmac, it was exciting. It was thrilling. What's going to happen? And they went wheel to wheel into turn 4, and Lando Norris was on the outside, which is always a bold overtaking maneuver into turn 4 to get it done around the outside. Can be done, but you really need to be fully like alongside and slightly ahead. And Lando was, and that was crucial because as they got to the apex, which is, you know, the kind of point in the corner that the FIA measures who owns the corner, is a way we can say, you know, who has the right to the corner. Lando was slightly ahead. And according to the existing driving guidelines that the FIA came up with and the stewards used to decide whether penalties should be given out, these guidelines are currently a hot topic in Formula One. But where they are right now, it says whoever has their front axle ahead at the apex, basically, has the right to the corner. And if you're the driver on the outside, that means that the driver on the inside must give you racing room, enough space to stay on track on the exit of the corner. And naturally, because they were both going so fast into this corner, they both washed out wide. It's actually a corner where if you take a normal racing line, you really want to be not so far over on the track because you're then setting yourself up for the right-hander at turn 5. And so Lando ended up going off the track. He was trying to keep it on, but as Max's car came across, he had no choice but to skip the corner, go on the inside of turn 5. And so that was the first penalty. And the penalty was for forcing another driver off the track, which, if you read the driving guidelines as they are, it's very hard to debate that because Lando did have his axle ahead. Whether that should be part of the guidelines, again, another question for another day between the drivers and the stewards. But as things stand, it's quite hard to debate that one. Christian Horner tried because he said that Lando would have gone off the track anyway. And part of those guidelines say that if you are overtaken on the outside, you need to make sure you stay on the track. But if you look at the onboard, Lando's still on track when he has to then divert and go and cut turn 5.
He bought receipts, didn't he? He came to the Sunday presser with the GPS tracking, you know, of everything. Which Horner, you know, I remember he used to do that. He would turn and kind of talk you through the race, but he clearly came knowing that would be the topic, and it was quite telling, I think, that he was, you know, getting into the numbers of could Lando have made the corner, etc., etc. He didn't try and defend the second one, but he was very adamant that that one shouldn't have been a penalty.
Yeah, so Christian was saying, look, Lando going into the corner was going 15 kilometers an hour faster than he did on his fastest lap of the race. So Christian's there saying, look, his fastest lap of the race is 15 kilometers an hour slower going into the corner. How did he ever expect to get it stopped? But I think there are, you know, that's on the surface a very convincing argument. But the other way of looking at it is that, well, you know, to take the correct line through that corner, correct racing line, again, like I said, to be further on the left of the circuit as you leave it so that you set yourself up for turn 5, you have to sacrifice quite a lot of speed going into that corner. But if you're trying to overtake someone around the outside, you know you're going to go deep because you have to go deep to get around the car that you're trying to overtake. So I don't think it was completely, hard evidence that he wouldn't have made the corner. And then if you look at the video, which I think is the main thing the stewards said they used to determine it, at the point that Lando has to turn out of the corner because Max's car is there and they're going to collide, he still has half of his car within the track limits. So whether he would have been able to keep it in there, that's a really hard judgment call. But if you look at the point where he had to turn out, it was when he still had half a car in track limits. So I think the stewards got that one right. And the maximum penalty you can give for that is 10 seconds. They will sometimes give a 5-second penalty if they think there's mitigating circumstances. But in this case, they felt that 10-second was valid. Then go 3 corners around the track and we're at turn 7. Lando has ended up ahead despite going off the track. So there's a question whether he has to give that position back because he's overtaken off circuit. You go into turn 7. Max throws up the inside. Turn 7 is not an obvious overtaking opportunity like turn 4 is. No one ever really passes there. And inevitably, both of them end up going off the track because Max takes so much speed to get his car up the inside that he goes off the track. And in doing that, Lando has to again take evasive action and go off the track. Max ends up ahead after that. Now, the stewards looked at that one and they didn't investigate forcing another driver off the track, which I think they could have. They investigated whether Max gained a lasting advantage by going off track. Now, of course, he gained the position back. So they said, yes, he did gain a lasting advantage by going off the track. Maximum penalty for that is 10 seconds again. So they end up with 20 seconds of penalties. Fine, but I actually think that the turn 7 incident, that second incident where it was for going off the track and gaining a lasting advantage, I actually think that one was far worse. It was far more aggressive. It was more dangerous. It still forced Lando off the track. So I think you absolutely have a forced drive off the track situation. And then also, if Max had just given that position back on the following straight, if he'd realized that he'd made this mistake and given the position back, then they wouldn't have been able to penalize him for going off the track and having a lasting advantage. And therefore, he could have got away with that, with the way the stewards ruled it. He could have got away without any penalty, which I think is wrong. So I think really the way they should have done it is like probably 20-second penalty seemed about right. But the reasons for the penalty, I wasn't so sure about. But anyway, I've spoken a lot about it now. Over to you guys to agree or disagree with me.
Well, I think the second one, to your point, absolutely overzealous. And you just wonder what his mindset is after turn 4, then going into turn 7. Like, is he in a rage? He's just like so competitive at that point in time. But to your point, if he backs off, I think you avoid that second situation altogether and you're in a much better place, Nate.
Yeah. And we see this with Max, don't we? We kind of saw both sides of Max Verstappen in the race. He always fights like that at turn 4. I think that's kind of the way now other drivers know that to get past Max, you've got to really pull off a great move. Lando now 2 races where he's kind of had similar situations on the outside and has ended up kind of being forced wide. But the second one is, we see this with Max, don't we? I think when he's in a championship fight, especially, it's like a switch goes off in his head and he's suddenly, that line of what's fair and isn't fair is obviously subjective to a lot of people. But what he did in that turn 8, there was no attempt to make the corner. It was just stay ahead, keep Lando behind me. And we saw glimpses of Max doing that in 2021. I mean, I think what made 21 such a compelling fight was that Lewis did something that I don't think Lando has done quite yet, which is that he's like, I'm going to not just fight you hard, I'm actually going to start putting my car in positions that if you also do the same thing, we're going to collide, which is kind of the way Max races. And that's not meant to be shade at Max either. I think it's actually one of the reasons why he's so good. He's so aggressive. And I think it's a good thing that when drivers approach him, they know that to get past him is going to have to be an incredible overtake. I mean, that's an incredible trait to have. And it's why Max is so feared and so revered in equal measure by drivers. But he just gets himself in these situations that he doesn't need to. And I think that the worst thing for me is that, and it's always been the way with Max, is that when he then gets asked about those things after the race, when it's clear what he's done, and Schumacher used to kind of come out and just be like, yeah, okay, yeah, I did that, and it doesn't make it right still, but there was at least an acknowledgement of like, okay, well, yeah, that was probably wrong. Max just kind of gets a bit funny, he was deflecting to the car isn't in the right place at the moment, which is actually true as well. But yeah, it does seem that he's never quite learned, over time that you can't overstep that line, or you shouldn't be allowed to overstep that line. And I thought it was telling. It was quite funny in the mix zone. I actually asked Lewis when he came through the mix zone, what did you make of the Max thing ahead? And it's always a tricky question for drivers because, yeah. So, but we'd kind of, we'd been waiting for the Mercedes guys. They've been right behind, and I figured, Lewis is going to love this opportunity. And he immediately says, I haven't seen it yet. And he was like, but, and you could see that he was like, but, and he said, when I was watching it ahead, I saw like a plume of smoke from, somebody locking up and going off. He said, I knew who it was. I knew exactly who it was. I didn't need to wait until I got there. And I don't think it's just Lewis that thinks that. I think now there's kind of an expectation that whenever someone gets close to Max now, that's going to happen. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe, he's fighting tooth and nail for the championship, but, it is a common theme now that Max is in these situations. And yeah, I think it seems to be a strength of his, but I think that if Lando can turn that around and start getting Max into a position where he does feel like he's on the ropes a bit more, does have to start driving like that a bit more, maybe we get a point where Max starts kind of almost kicking himself his championship hopes himself a little bit, getting more penalties, getting himself into sloppy situations. We'll see how it plays out. But I think it was the first time we've had as well of, I don't want to say desperation, but definitely a driver that could sense that, he's losing control a little bit of that situation.
And
Yeah.
here's the point with the racing regulations the way they are, and I think the way that Max uses them, because we have this rule about the driver that's ahead at the apex, it means your first objective in that corner is to get ahead at the apex.
Yeah.
So you end up just throwing the car in there. And that's a little bit of what we saw in Austin, and obviously that one worked for Max because he made sure he was at the apex first. Both the cars went off the track, but he then knew once both cars were off the track, within the rules of the regulations, Lando can't then rejoin ahead because he's then overtaken off the track, and that's against the rules. So it seems like while there's an element of Max kind of perhaps, I think with turn 7, it was pure red mist. He was angry about what happened in turn 4 and losing that position and was just trying to, I don't know what he was trying to do, but trying to get back ahead. But I think, but yeah, in terms of, because he's so talented and because he has this impeccable ability to place his car on the brakes into a corner, he's actually able to take advantage of these regulations the way they're written and create these situations and usually leave it to the other driver to say, you either collide with me or we both go off the track, or you're going off the track by yourself. And so, I think that's a difficulty. In Mexico, of course, he got it slightly wrong because Lando was ahead. But I think that's also because Lando had the same mentality at that point. He'd seen what happened in Austin, and he said going into the Mexico weekend, he needs to change the way race. So he also knew that if he was ahead at the apex at that point, there was half a chance that he gets to claim the position in some way or force Max into a penalty. And this is a situation where it's getting a bit silly. And this is why these racing guidelines need to be revised.
Okay.
I don't know exactly what the answer is, but also I'm not a racing driver. I think we need the racing drivers to sit down, which is what they're planning to do by Qatar, and have a proper set of regulations so that you don't have these situations where someone like Max, who is just so impeccably talented on the brakes, being able to take advantage of it.
Okay, you answered my follow-up of, well, is a revision needed? Could a revision actually happen before the end of the season, or is that something you think would be in between seasons?
So Qatar seems to be the point at which they're going to come back together and try and agree on a revision. If they can do that, then in theory, the last 2 races of the season can be run under the new rules. However, if there's still some disagreement, then we're looking at 2025. And these driving guidelines, I think they came in 2022, but they've never been published beyond the teams and the drivers. So you have to work quite hard to figure out what's actually in them. But the reason the FIA say they did that was because they are kind of there to be changed. They're and also their guidelines. The stewards use them as best they can to interpret a racing situation. But the fantastic thing, but also quite difficult thing when you're a steward about Formula One racing, is that no 2 incidents are the same, yet you've got to try and be as consistent as you can be. There's no way 2 cars moving at those speeds into a different type of corner on a different circuit, in different states of tire wear, fuel load, all that kind of stuff. There's no way you can consistently judge across the board because the incidents can be so different. There can be so many factors involved. And that's the real challenge facing the stewards. So you've got to come up with a set of guidelines that make sense. They aren't open to loopholes and drivers, throwing the car at the apex, but equally they provide enough framework for the stewards to be able to make consistent decisions. Because otherwise we end up in this situation where, everyone is kind of complaining about this decision, that decision. We're waiting after races for decisions. We're seeing drivers give positions back. Niki Lauda used to say when he was the Mercedes chairman, he used to say, just let them race. Just let them race. Get rid of these rules. Let them race. But to do that, you need the drivers. You need to be able to trust the drivers to do it responsibly, and you need the drivers to trust each other to do it responsibly. And I think because we've had these regulations in place, we've lost a bit of that trust because they've just been relying on the regulations rather than each other to get these situations sorted out. So it's really hard to know what the answer is. But I'm hoping by the drivers and the stewards And the people who really know what they're talking about, not people like me, people that really know what they talk about, know what it's like to be in those situations, they together can come up with a set of regulations that make sense, don't leave loopholes, and allow us just to enjoy the racing and not have too much steward interference.
Thanks so much for watching ESPN on YouTube. And for more sports highlights and analysis, be sure to download the ESPN app. And for premium content and live streaming, subscribe to ESPN Plus.